Using public transport during rush hour is often fraught with stressful situations and all sorts of misunderstandings. Nancy Davis had to go through it almost every morning. Since she and her mother had recently moved into a new neighborhood, and now she had to take public transportation to get to college. The woman always got on the bus at the first stop on its route and sat in the seat indicated in her ticket. However, that day, one of the other passengers asked her to switch seats. So she ended up sitting in a different seat than the one that was assigned to her. Without giving it a second thought, Nancy took a book out of her backpack and started reading. Since the woman made the commute every day, she'd already gotten used to the nervous passengers, which were mostly office employees rushing to work. Meanwhile, Nancy always tried not to attract unnecessary attention to herself and stay pretty much invisible. This was due to the fact that she was modest and quiet by nature. With each stop, the bus got more and more passengers. That day, in addition to the office people and students, there was a controller riding the bus. He was dressed in a service uniform with a special badge on the lapel of his jacket. Alfred Brooks had been working for the city transportation company for years and had seen a lot. "Attention passengers, please show your tickets," announced the controller and got up from his seat. The man was in a terrible mood, which was all too obvious, even from a distance. Cautiously glancing at the controller, the passengers began to pull out their crumbled tickets from the depths of their pockets and purses. Nancy paid her fare, so she wasn't worried about the ticket check. The only problem was that she was sitting in the wrong seat. Back at the first stop, Nancy switched places with an elderly man who wanted to sit by the window. The fact was that he had long been tormented by shortness of breath, and fresh air that came from the half-open window eased his condition. Nancy agreed to switch places with him without hesitation, as she respected his age and didn't want to upset the elderly man. Meanwhile, Alfred Brooks approached her and demanded to see her ticket. It was his first time working this route. He'd previously worked on a completely different one, and therefore Alfred didn't know any of the regulars. Nancy immediately complied with the controller's request and, smiling shyly, handed over her ticket. Alfred checked the ticket next to the seat number Nancy was sitting in and frowned. "Why aren't you sitting in your seat? Why did you mess up the seating? When you go to the theater, you don't take other people's seats, now do you?" "I'm sorry, but I didn't take this seat on a whim," the woman answered quietly. She was so ashamed that tears filled up her eyes. But there was no stopping Alfred Brooks. He pounced on the unfortunate woman like an angel of revenge. "I know your kind. You don't care about order. You sit where you want and bring chaos into the public transportation system," answered the angry controller. Nancy tried to object to Mr. Brooks, but he didn't want to hear any of it, reveling in his power. At that moment, the elderly man who had asked Nancy to switch seats looked at her with pity and, sighing sadly, stood up. He was very sorry for the woman, whom the controller brought to tears with his accusations. "Sir, please don't be mad. I asked this charming young lady to switch seats with me. If someone is to blame, it's me," the man intervened. Alfred looked at the stranger in surprise and seemed to get embarrassed for a moment. His theory about troublemakers was clearly being undermined. He didn't want to deal with two passengers at the same time, but he couldn't give up without a fight either. "You should both be ashamed of yourselves for lying to a man on the job," the controller said. The elderly man tried to object, but the driver announced the next stop over the loudspeaker at that very moment. Knowing that she had to get out at that stop, Nancy got up from her seat and, feeling ashamed under the eyes of the controller, pulled out her walking stick, which she hid under the seat. Then, limping on her left leg, she slowly made her way to the exit. Needless to say, the rest of the passengers felt very uncomfortable. The most upset was the elderly man, who didn't even suspect that Nancy had an illness. The thing was that the young woman was ashamed of her lameness, and trying not to attract attention to herself on the bus, hid her cane under the seat. "Excuse me, miss. This is my first time working this route," Mr. Brooks began, but the woman only waved her hand in response. Nancy had long been accustomed to the fact that people sympathized with her and tried not to make her condition into anything special. Instead, she cautiously got off the bus and, leaning on her cane, walked towards the college. The elderly man sitting in Nancy's seat followed her with his eyes and got lost in thought. The young woman had no way of knowing that the man's name was Thomas Johnson and that he was a successful businessman who owned a chain of stores located throughout the city. Impressed by what Nancy did, Mr. Thompson decided to pay her back. First, he made inquiries about Nancy at the university, describing in detail her appearance and characteristic limp. Thus, the elderly businessman learned the name of the woman who stood up for him on the bus. Of course, given the size of his fortune, Thomas Johnson could easily travel around the city in an air-conditioned car. But the elderly businessman was old-fashioned and still resorted to the services of public transport from time to time, so as to not forget his past. Thus, Mr. Johnson learned that a year ago, Nancy was hit by a drunk driver at the crosswalk. Even though the driver was immediately detained, the young woman still ended up at the hospital with multiple fractures of both legs. It was this incident that left Nancy with a limp, which could only be treated with the surgery at one of the specialized clinics in New York. So why didn't they do the surgery? After all, the accident happened over a year ago, Mr. Johnson asked in surprise, talking to the dean of the university Nancy attended. Well, how do I put it? Such surgeries are very expensive. Nancy lives with her mother and little brother. Unfortunately, her family can't pay for the treatment, the dean explained sadly. Having heard the dean out, Mr. Johnson thought for a moment and then decided to help Nancy. In addition to the successful business, he had accounts in many banks in the country. However, Thomas Johnson didn't like to stand out and flaunt his financial well-being. The man still remembered the times when he was just starting his business and had to live hand to mouth in order to make his dreams come true. The most interesting thing was that having achieved financial success, Thomas Johnson remained a kind and compassionate person. Having decided to help Nancy, the businessman used all of his connections in order to find the contacts of the clinic specializing in injuries of the musculoskeletal system. Money wasn't of particular importance to Mr. Johnson, since he understood that the health of the young woman was much more important than the number of zeros on his bank account statement. Part of the reasoning behind the businessman's decision was the fact that he was a lonely widower who lost his family in a terrible car accident. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the accident, Thomas Johnson hadn't been able to let anyone into his life. Instead, the elderly businessman got himself a Labrador, Spike, whom he took on walks in the park every evening. Having first saw Nancy on the bus, Mr. Thompson experienced some sort of a fatherly feeling towards her. After all, if his daughter didn't die in the car accident, she would have been about the same age as Nancy. It took Thomas Johnson about a week to find the clinic that could do the surgery and make the necessary arrangements. Having learned the young woman's address, the elderly businessman put on his best suit and went to pay her a visit. Needless to say, Nancy was surprised to see her recent acquaintance from that hectic bus ride at her door. "Hello, Nancy. My name is Thomas Johnson. I brought you a small gift," the businessman said and handed her a folder. Inside, there were documents, a ticket for a flight to New York, and a paid bill for the surgery at one of the best clinics there. Glancing over the documents, Nancy nearly fainted, and Nancy's mother couldn't hold back her tears when she saw what was happening. The woman offered Mr. Johnson some tea, but he politely refused, since he was barely keeping it together, afraid that he might burst into tears at any moment. Leaving Nancy's house, the man knew that he had done the right thing, which his daughter and wife, whom he believed were watching him from heaven, would definitely have approved of. 3 months have passed. One day, walking his dog in the park, the businessman saw Nancy walking hand in hand with a young man who was clearly her boyfriend. Having spotted Mr. Johnson, the woman quickly approached him and gave him a huge hug, completely unfazed by the young man she was with. The businessman couldn't help but tear up, seeing that the surgery was successful. Nancy got rid of her lameness forever and had found true happiness. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. You're a miracle worker. You helped me get back to normal life," the young woman whispered. As if to confirm Nancy's words, Spike licked his master's face and barked invitingly. Having said goodbye to Nancy, Mr. Johnson followed his dog, who had already spotted a squirrel and decided to chase it. And the young couple looked at the elderly man for a long time, whose kind heart changed their lives for the better.